He sold everything to clear her father's debt. She rode 200 miles to find him. Cora Hadfield did not learn what Stellan Voss had done until 3 weeks after he was gone. She learned it from the banker in Juniper Bend, a man named Crisp who wore spectacles and spoke in numbers, and who told her, with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering news that confirmed his view of human nature, that the debt her father owed, $1,400 against the ranch, 2 years overdue, interest compounding like a slow disease, had been paid in full. "By whom?" Cora asked. "By your foreman, Mr. Voss. He sold his horses, his saddle, his wagon, and the 40 acres he held east of town. The proceeds covered the balance exactly. He settled the account on Tuesday and left Wednesday morning." Cora stood in the bank with her hands on the counter and the world rearranging itself around her. Stellan Voss had been her father's foreman for 6 years. He had run the ranch through her father's illness, through the drought that killed half their cattle, through the slow accumulation of debt that had pressed against the Hadfield family like a weight they could not shift. He had done this without complaint, without extra pay, without anything in return except the small cabin behind the barn and 3 meals a day at the kitchen table where Cora served them. He had eaten those meals with the careful gratitude of a man who understood that a place at someone's table was not a small thing. He said grace before every meal, silently, with his head bowed and his hands in his lap, and Cora had watched this small ritual hundreds of times and had come to understand that the grace was not for the food. It was for the fact of being there, at the table, in the house, part of something that was not his, but that he treated as though it were. She had been in love with him for 2 of those 6 years. She had not told him. She had kept it folded inside her, the way a person keeps a letter they are not ready to send, rereading it in private, adjusting the words, never quite finding the courage to put it in someone else's hands. Once, on a September evening when the light was amber and the aspens had turned gold along the creek, she had found him standing at the corral fence watching the horses, and she had stood beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his arm, and he had looked at her, and she had looked at him, and the thing they were both not saying had hung between them like smoke, visible, shapeless, impossible to hold. He had opened his mouth as if to speak, and then he had looked away, and the moment had passed, the way all their moments passed, into the accumulation of things postponed. She had thought there was time. She had thought that the ranch and the work and the daily proximity of 2 people who understood each other would eventually produce the conversation that both of them were avoiding. Instead, Stellan had sold everything he owned, paid her father's debt, and disappeared. Her father, Thomas Hadfield, was 61 and had been sick for 2 years with a weakness in his chest that the doctor called consumption and that Thomas called an inconvenience. He sat in his chair by the stove when Cora came home from the bank and told him. "He paid the debt," Thomas said. "All of it." "With what?" "Everything. His horses, his land, his wagon. He sold it all." Thomas was quiet for a long time. He looked at the stove and the wall and the window and the light on the mountains, and Cora could see him turning the information over the way a man turns a stone, looking for what is underneath. "He did it for you," Thomas said. "He did it for the ranch. He did it for you, Cora. The ranch is just the reason he could give himself." Cora did not sleep that night. She lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Stellan Voss, his quiet competence, his steady hands, the way he looked at her across the supper table with an expression she had interpreted as respect and now understood was something larger and more costly. He had given up everything he had so that she could keep what was hers, and he had left so that the giving would not feel like an obligation. She understood the mathematics of it. A man who has nothing cannot stay in the house of a woman he loves without the relationship becoming unequal, and Stellan was a man for whom equality was not negotiable. He had leveled the debt and removed himself from the equation, and the logic of it was clean and terrible, and exactly the kind of thing he would do. She understood, and the understanding made her furious. Not at him. She could not be furious at a man who had impoverished himself for her family, but at the world that had constructed this situation, at the debt that had grown like a tumor, at the disease that had taken her father's strength, at the silence she had kept when she should have spoken. If she had told him how she felt, if she had said the words that she had rehearsed 100 times and delivered 0, he might have stayed. He might have sold his things and stayed, and the staying would have been different, because it would have been a staying that included her. But she had not spoken, and he had not stayed, and now 200 miles of mountain and desert lay between them. In the morning, Cora saddled her horse. "Where are you going?" Thomas asked from his chair. "To find him." "You do not know where he went." "He went north. He always talked about the silver country, Idaho, the Sawtooth Valley. That is 200 miles. I know how far it is." Thomas looked at his daughter. She was 27, lean and capable, with the same stubborn jaw he saw in the mirror, and the same inability to leave a thing undone that had kept him ranching through drought and debt and disease. He knew there was nothing he could say that would stop her, and he was not sure he wanted to. "Take the rifle," he said, "and come back with him." She rode north. She followed the road to Silver Basin, and then the trail beyond it, asking at every town and every ranch and every way station whether a man matching Stellan's description had passed through. He was not difficult to describe. Tall, dark-haired, 32, quiet in the way that made people remember his silence rather than his face. He would have been on foot or riding a borrowed horse, because he had sold his own. In the town of Bridger, a storekeeper remembered him. He had come through 4 days ago, bought beans and coffee and a wool blanket, and headed north toward the mining camps in the Sawtooth foothills. In Haley, a blacksmith remembered shoeing a horse for a man who matched the description, a man who had paid with his last coins and asked about work in the mines. Cora rode. She rode through rain and through the kind of mountain cold that settles into the bones and stays there. She slept on the ground, wrapped in her own blanket, and ate hardtack and dried beef, and drank from streams that ran clear and cold from the snowfields above. She rode through country she had never seen, mountains that rose in walls of dark pine and gray rock, valleys so deep and narrow that the sun touched the bottom only at noon. She was afraid, not of the country or the solitude, but of what she would find at the end of it, a man who had left because he loved her, and who might not come back for the same reason. On the 4th day, her horse threw a shoe on a rocky trail above the Salmon River, and she led the animal 3 miles to a ranch, where a woman gave her water, and a farrier replaced the shoe and refused payment, because, the woman said, any woman riding alone through this country for a reason deserved help getting there. On the 5th day, she crossed a pass at 9,000 feet, where the wind cut through her coat like paper, and the trail narrowed to a ledge that dropped away into a valley so deep she could not see the bottom. She dismounted and led the horse on foot, one hand on the bridle and one hand on the rock wall, and she did not look down, because looking down would mean thinking about what she was risking, and she had already decided that the risk was worth it. She found him in a mining camp called Silver Fork, a collection of tents and shacks perched on a hillside above a creek that ran milky with tailings. He was sitting outside a canvas tent, mending a boot with a curved needle and a piece of leather. He looked thinner than she remembered, and his clothes were worn, and the hands that held the needle, the same hands that had gentled her father's horses and mended her father's fences and built the shelves in her kitchen without being asked, were cracked and rough from work that was beneath them. He looked up and saw her, and the needle stopped moving. He sat on the log outside his tent and looked at her, the way a man looks at something he has convinced himself he will never see again. "Cora," he said. She dismounted. Her legs were stiff from riding, and her back ached, and her clothes were dirty, and her hair had come loose from its braid in the way that hair does after 6 days on horseback. She stood in the mud of the mining camp and looked at the man who had sold everything he owned so that she could keep everything she had. "You left," she said. "Yes, without telling me. I could not tell you, because you knew I would stop you, because I knew if I saw your face, I would not be able to go." Cora felt her throat tighten. She stood in the mud and the tailings and the thin mountain air and looked at this man who had loved her in the most selfless way she had ever seen. and the most infuriating way she could imagine. "You sold your horses," she said. "They were mine to sell." "You sold your land. It was mine to sell. You paid my father's debt. It needed paying. And then you disappeared. You walked away from everything, from the ranch, from my father, from me, as though none of it mattered." "It all mattered. That is why I left." "That does not make sense." "It makes perfect sense. A man who has nothing cannot stand in front of a woman he loves and ask her for anything. The asking would be—" He stopped. The word he was looking for was somewhere between unfair and unbearable, and he could not find it. "The asking would be what?" Cora said. "Honest?" "The asking would be honest, Stellan. The asking is all I ever wanted." He looked at her. The mining camp was noisy around them, picks and hammers and the shouts of men working the creek. But the noise was far away, belonging to a world that had nothing to do with the two of them standing in the mud with 6 years of unsaid things between them. "I have nothing," he said. "I have a tent and a pair of boots I am mending, and a pick I borrowed from a man named Hicks. I cannot ask you to—" "You are not asking me anything. I am telling you. I rode 200 miles to tell you. I love you, Stellan. I have loved you for 2 years. I loved you when you were the foreman, and I loved you when you sold your horses, and I love you now, standing in a mining camp with a borrowed pick and a mended boot, because the things you sold are not the things that matter." Stellan set down the boot and the needle. He stood up from the log. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she had gotten smaller over the 6 days of riding, and his face did something she had never seen it do. It broke open, not in sadness, but in the sudden overwhelming release of something he had been holding closed for years. "Cora," he said, and his voice was not steady. "Come home," she said. "The debt is paid. The ranch is ours. Come home and be my husband, and stop trying to save me from things I do not want to be saved from." He put his arms around her and held her in the mud and the noise and the thin mountain air, and she held him back, and the mining camp went on around them and neither of them noticed. They rode south together, 200 miles of trail and road and mountain pass, sleeping beside each other under the stars, talking in the way that people talk when they have finally said the thing they were afraid to say and discovered that the saying was the easiest part. Stellan told her about the weeks after he left. He told her about the walk north with nothing but a bedroll and the clothes on his back. He told her about the loneliness that had been worse than any loneliness he had known, because this loneliness was self-inflicted and therefore carried the additional weight of knowing he had chosen it. He told her about the nights in the mining camp when he had lain in his tent and listened to the creek and thought about her face at the kitchen table and her voice calling the horses and the way the lamplight caught her hair when she braided it at night. He told her all of this with the halting, unpracticed honesty of a man who has never been in the habit of saying what he feels and is learning how. They talked about the ranch and the debt and the future, and they talked about the years of silence and the cost of it, and Stellan said he was sorry for leaving, and Cora said he should be, and then she said she understood, and then she said she forgave him, and then she said, if he ever did it again, she would follow him to the ends of the earth and drag him back by his collar. They were married in Juniper Bend by the circuit preacher, in the parlor of the Hadfield Ranch, with Thomas as witness. Thomas, who had been too sick to stand for longer than 10 minutes, stood for 15 and did not sit down until the ceremony was over. The banker, Mr. Crisp, heard about the wedding and sent a note of congratulation and a suggestion that the newlyweds consider a savings account, which was the most romantic thing Crisp had ever done. Stellan rebuilt what he had sold. He bought horses, one at a time, choosing carefully, trading and training with the patience that was his particular gift. He did not buy back the 40 acres east of town. He did not need them. He had the ranch and the woman, and the life he had tried to walk away from, and that had followed him 200 miles into the mountains, because it refused to let him go. The woman who had ridden to find him, and the man who had sold everything to save her, built a life on the foundation of a debt that had been paid twice, once in money, and once in the 200 miles between Juniper Bend and a mining camp called Silver Fork, where a man with nothing had been found by a woman who told him that nothing was enough.